Viewers at home, you are welcome to my presentation on fixed production overhead variances. Fixed production overhead variances. In this presentation, I will examine the total fixed production overhead variance, which shall be divided into two: the fixed overhead expenditure variance and fixed overhead volume variance. This expenditure variance can as well be called fixed overhead budget variance. And the fixed overhead volume variance will be divided into two: the fixed overhead capacity variance and fixed overhead efficiency variance. All this shall be covered in this lecture. So I will examine the total fixed overhead variance, which shall be divided into fixed overhead expenditure variance and fixed overhead volume variance. And the fixed overhead volume variance will be divided into capacity variance and efficiency variance. That means we are going to cover 5 variances under fixed overheads: the total, the expenditure, the volume, the capacity, and efficiency, making 5. So, what do we mean by total fixed overhead variance? Total fixed overhead variance. Total fixed overhead variance represents under or over absorbed fixed production overheads. It represents the amount of under or over absorbed fixed overheads. That is when you absorb your fixed overheads. So the difference will represent the amount of under absorption or over absorption of fixed production overheads. So when you have under absorption, that is an adverse variance. Under absorption is an adverse variance, while over absorption is a favorable variance. Therefore, total fixed production overhead variance is the difference between the fixed production overheads absorbed and the actual fixed production overheads incurred. The difference between the fixed production overheads absorbed and the actual fixed production overheads incurred is said to be the fixed production overheads, total fixed production overhead variance. So I've told you that the difference represents the amount of under absorption or over absorption. I've told you that under absorption, I said this is an adverse variance. Adverse. Why over absorption is a favorable variance. Favorable variance. So under absorption is an adverse variance, while over absorption is a favorable variance. So if you have watched my presentation on overheads or even under marginal absorption costing, I considered or I examined the under and over absorption of fixed overheads. So what do we mean by overhead absorbed? Overhead absorption is a process of attributing or the process of charging an indirect cost to the product. The process of charging an indirect cost to the product is said to be an absorption. Therefore, to absorb your overheads, you are going to absorb overhead using overhead absorption rate. So I want to use fixed overhead absorption rate. Fixed overhead absorption rate is equal to budgeted overheads, budgeted fixed overheads, fixed overheads over budgeted level of activity. Budgeted level of activity. I've told you that in my previous presentation, I've told you that the level of activity could be direct labor, it could be direct materials, it could be machine hours, it could be unit of output. So now, for the purpose of this variance, your overhead absorption rate could be calculated based on unit of output. Units of output, that is budgeted unit of output. Budgeted units of output or budgeted direct labor hour. Budgeted direct labor hours. So I've told you that overhead absorption rate is budgeted overheads over budgeted level of activities. Now your budgeted direct labor hour, where the denominator is budgeted direct labor hour, that means your fixed overhead absorption rate will be the rate per direct labor hour. So your result will be per direct labor hour. So meaning that your fixed overhead absorption rate will now become budgeted fixed overheads, budgeted fixed overheads over budgeted. The level of activity now become budgeted. We now have the level of activity become direct labor hour. So in case the result obtained is $B, that means it will be $B per direct labor hour. That will be the fixed overhead absorption rate. Whatever value you have, maybe it is $2 or $3, it will be per direct labor hour. But if you want to use the budgeted units of output, that means your overhead absorption rate, your fixed overhead absorption rate, FOAR, fixed overhead absorption rate. The formula will become budgeted fixed overheads over budgeted units of output or budgeted production or budgeted units of output. That will be in unit. The production will be in unit. So meaning that the rate you obtain, fixed overhead absorption rate, if it is $8, it will be $8 per unit. So the result will be per unit, it will be per unit and not per hour. It will be per unit. So that is fixed overhead absorption rate. Now, on that purpose, I've told you that you are going to absorb your fixed production overheads to the product. You are going to absorb your fixed production overheads to the product. How will you calculate the fixed production overheads absorbed? Fixed production overheads absorbed, the amount you absorb to the product, will be obtained by multiplying your fixed overhead absorption rate per hour. It will be obtained by multiplying your fixed overhead absorption rate per hour by the unit of output, by your actual output or actual production. So to calculate the amount of overhead absorbed, you multiply your overhead absorption rate per hour. So the one obtained when you use labor hourly rate, you multiply that by the actual output. That will give you the overheads absorbed. So now you compare your overhead absorbed with the actual overheads. That means your total fixed overheads variance will now be equal to fixed production overheads absorbed, fixed production overheads absorbed, the one absorbed which have been obtained from this, the one you have obtained here, that is the one absorbed minus actual fixed production overheads. The actual will be given. The actual will be given directly in the question. So that will give you the fixed production overheads variance. Fixed production overheads variance. I've told you that this variance represents the amount of under or over absorption. It is under absorption where the one absorbed here is less than the actual. And it is over absorption where the one absorbed here is greater than the actual. I've told you that under absorption represents an adverse variance, while over absorption represents a favorable variance. So now I've told you that the total fixed overheads variance, I said it will be divided into two. The fixed overheads expenditure variance and fixed overheads volume variance. I therefore want to consider the fixed overheads expenditure variance. Therefore, what is fixed overheads expenditure variance? Fixed overheads expenditure variance. Fixed overheads expenditure, fixed production overheads expenditure variance is the difference between the budgeted fixed production overheads and the actual fixed production overheads incurred. The difference between the budgeted fixed production overheads and the actual fixed production overheads incurred is said to be the fixed production overheads budget variance, expenditure variance, fixed production overheads expenditure variance. Remember, I've told you that another word for fixed production overheads expenditure is the fixed overheads budget variance. Since it is a budget, that means you want to compare your budgeted fixed overheads with actual fixed overheads. Therefore, your fixed overheads expenditure variance, you want to compare your budgeted fixed overheads with actual. So you want to compare budget with actual minus actual fixed overheads. The easiest way you can remember is that if you know that your fixed overhead expenditure variance is fixed overhead budget variance, that means you are going to compare your budget with actual. This budgeted fixed overheads may not be given in the question. So where it is not given, you will need to calculate it. How can you calculate the budgeted fixed overheads? Your budgeted fixed overheads, how can you calculate that? So we have budgeted fixed overheads, budgeted fixed overheads, and that can be calculated in two ways. One, the first way or first method is multiply your fixed overhead absorption rate per hour, that is your standard rate per hour, fixed overhead absorption rate per hour, or your standard rate per hour. This is the same as standard rate. Fixed overhead absorption rate per hour. In case you are given the standard rate, you know that it is the same as your fixed overhead absorption rate. The one per hour multiplied by the budgeted output, budgeted production, or budgeted output. If you multiply your rate per hour by the budgeted production, it will give you the budgeted fixed overheads. Another way is by multiplying your fixed overheads absorption rate per unit. Fixed overheads absorption rate per unit by the budgeted by budgeted hour. The rate per unit. Fees overhead absorption rate per hour. The rate per hour, you multiply the rate per hour by the budgeted hours. Budgeted hours. Since it is rate per hour, then you multiply by the budgeted hours. Why the second one is to multiply your fees overhead absorption rate per unit by the budgeted production or budgeted output. That will give you the fees overheads, the budgeted fees overheads. Sometimes the budgeted hours may not be given, and you may want to compute your budgeted hours where your budgeted hours is not given. And if you want to compute your budgeted hours, you have budgeted hours equals to the standard hours multiplied by budgeted production. Standard hours multiplied by the budgeted production. That will give us the budgeted hours. So that is for fees production overheads budget variance, or fees production overheads expenditure variance. Number 3, fees production overheads volume variance. Fees production overheads volume variance. Another word for volume is output, productive output, the unit produced. That is the meaning of volume. So know that when you are talking about volume, you are talking about output. If volume means output, there are two outputs you can see in the question. Number 1 is the budgeted output, and the second output is the actual output. That means you want to compare your budgeted output with the actual output. Fees production overhead volume variance is the difference between the budgeted production output and the actual production output multiplied by the standard absorption rate per unit. Fees production overhead volume variance, fees production overhead volume variance. We said it is the difference. Fees production overhead volume variance. We said it is the difference between the budgeted output, This output is in unit, the one based on the budget. Budgeted output minus actual output or actual production. Budgeted production minus actual production multiplied by, remember these two are in unit. Your budgeted production is in unit and actual production is also in unit. That means the weight will be per unit. So our weight will be standard rate per unit multiplied by the standard rate per unit. Multiplied by the standard rate per unit. That is fees production overhead volume variance. That is the first formula. The second formula you can equally use to calculate the fees production overhead volume variance. We have fees production overheads volume variance. equals to budgeted hours. You are using hours this time around minus standard hours. Budgeted hours minus standard hours multiplied by the standard rate per standard rate. This time around will be standard rate per hour. Standard rate per hour. Budgeted hour, since this is hours and this is hours, so the rate will be per hour. But this one unit, this one unit, the rate will be per unit. That is for fixed production overheads volume variance. The next variance I'm going to consider under fixed production overheads is fixed production overheads efficiency variance. Fixed production overheads efficiency variance. What is fixed production overheads efficiency variance? That is number 4. Fixed production overheads efficiency variance. This is the difference between the number of hours that the actual production will have taken and the number of hours actually taken multiplied by the standard absorption rate per hour. The difference between the number of hours that actual production should have taken and the number of hours actually taken multiplied by the standard absorption rate per hour. So your efficiency variance, the formula for efficiency variance, we have efficiency variance under labor, we have under variable overheads, and we equally have for fixed overhead. So efficiency is always efficiency. The formula will be the same, which is the standard hours based on actual production minus the actual hours multiplied by the standard rate. That is fixed overheads efficiency variance. The number 5, the last one before we take a work example, is fixed overhead capacity variance. Fixed overhead capacity variance. Fixed overhead capacity variance. Capacity variance. This is the difference between the budgeted hours of work. The difference between the budgeted hours of work and the actual hours worked multiplied by the standard absorption rate per hour. The difference between the budgeted hours of work and the actual hours worked multiplied by the standard absorption rate per hour. That is fixed overhead capacity variance. So we have the difference between the budgeted hours and actual hours. So we have actual hours worked minus budgeted hours multiplied by the standard rate. So since this is in hours and this is in hour, it will be standard rate per hour. Standard rate per hour. So those are the 5 variances we have under fixed overheads. We therefore want to take a question as work example, and this question is obtained from Kaplan ACCA study test F5 performance management. So we have the question. The following information is available for J Limited for period 4. The following information is available for J Limited for period 4. We have budget. We are given the budget, and then we are equally given, we have the budget, and under budget we have fixed production overheads, and that is $22,960. Fixed production overheads, $22,960. Then we have units. The budgeted units is 6,560 units. 6,560. That is units. So meaning that this information are based on budget. Then we have the standard time to produce. The standard time to produce each unit is 2 hours. The standard time to produce each unit is 2 hours. You are not given information about actual. You have actual. We have fixed production overheads, and that is 24,200. That is the actual fixed production overheads, $24,200. Then we have units. That means that is the actual output. That is the actual units produced, actual production or actual output, and that is given to be 6,460 units. We have the actual labor hour, and that is 12,600 hours required if J Limited uses an absorption costing. If J Limited uses an absorption costing system, calculate the following. A. Fixed overhead absorption rate per labor hour. Fixed overhead absorption rate per labor hour. B. Total fixed overhead variance. You have to compute the total fixed overhead variance. C. Fixed overhead expenditure variance. Fixed overhead expenditure variance. D. Fixed overhead volume variance. Fixed overhead volume variance. E. Fixed overhead efficiency variance. Fixed overhead efficiency variance. F. Fixed overhead capacity variance. These are the variances required. So we therefore want to solve for J Limited. J Limited. The name of the entity is J Limited. So if you look at the requirement A, in the requirement A, you are to compute the fixed overhead absorption rate per labor hour. Fixed overhead absorption rate per labor hour. I've told you that the fixed overhead absorption rate per labor hour will be budgeted fixed overheads, budgeted fixed overheads over budgeted direct labor hour. Budgeted labor hours. So you have to check your budget information in order to find out the amount of fixed production overheads based on budget. Check your budgeted detail. Check your budget detail in order to find out the amount of fixed production overheads based on budget. Now back to the budget. You have budget. You have budget. Fixed production overheads 22,960. That is the budgeted fixed overheads. Then you are given units to be 6,560. Then you are given standard time to produce each unit. Remember, the denominator will be budgeted labor hours or budgeted direct labor hour. So, and you need the budgeted overheads, which is given, but you are given the units, not the unit we are to calculate. We have to compute it per labor hour. Now, and you are given the units of output. Then you are given the standard units. Standard time to produce. Each unit is 2 hours. Standard time to produce each unit is 2 hours. That is standard hours. Therefore, you will need to compute your budgeted labor hour. Budgeted direct labor hour. Budgeted direct labor hour. Your budgeted direct labor hour will be obtained by multiplying your standard rate by the budgeted production. Your budgeted direct labor hour will be obtained by multiplying your standard hours. Standard hours multiplied by budgeted production or budgeted output. The standard hours, as it is given in the question, is given to be 2 hours, and the budgeted production is given to be 6,560. Therefore, budgeted hours now. So our budgeted hours now, which is standard hours of 2 hours multiplied by the budgeted production of 6,560, and that will give us 2 times 6,560. Then we have 13,120 hours. So that is the labor hour. This is the budgeted labor hour. Let me include labor. Budgeted labor hours. Now that we have obtained the budgeted labor hour, therefore we can compute our fixed overhead absorption rate, which is budgeted fixed overheads. And our budgeted fixed overheads, as given in the question, as it is given, you have fixed budget fixed production overheads 22,960. You have $22,960 divided by the budgeted labor hour, and our budgeted labor hour is 13,120, and that will give us 22,960 divided by 13,120. That will be 1.75 per labor hour. You know, the denominator is labor, is the labor hour. The numerator is the cost. That is why we have the cost per labor hour. So that is the fixed overhead absorption rate. That is the requirement A. So requirement B. Now back to the question. You are to compute the total fixed overheads variance. Total fixed overheads variance. Remember, I've told you that the total fixed overhead represents the amount of under or over absorption. So total fixed overheads variance. If it represents the amount of under or over absorption of fixed overheads, that means it will be the difference between fixed overheads absorbed and the actual fixed overheads incurred. Now, I've told you that to absorb your fixed overheads, remember this rate we've obtained is the rate per hour. And I've told you that to absorb your fixed overheads absorbed, I said it can be obtained by multiplying the rate per unit. That is fixed overhead absorption rate per unit by the actual production. By actual production in units. What we need is the rate per unit. And the rate per unit can be obtained in two ways. Fixed overhead absorption rate per unit or standard rate per unit can be obtained in two ways. Number one, the first way, fixed overhead absorption rate per unit. The first method is to multiply the standard hours, which is 2 hours, by the rate per unit. By the rate per hour. The standard hours of 2 times rate per hour, which is 1.75 per hour. And that will give you 1.75 times 2. Then we have $3.5 per unit. This is the standard rate per unit. Standard rate per unit. Another method is to have your budgeted fixed overhead absorption rate per unit is by dividing your budgeted fixed overheads by the budgeted output. Budgeted output or budgeted production. Budgeted overheads divided by budgeted output. Your budgeted fixed overheads is given to be $22,960. $22,960. And the budgeted output. No, this information we obtain from the budget. The budgeted fixed overhead is $22,960. The budgeted output is $6,560. So if you have $22,960 divided by $6,560, and that will give you the fixed overhead absorption rate per unit. So we have $22,960 divided by $6,560, and that will give us. We have $22,960 divided by $6,560. Then we have $3.5 per unit. Those are the two ways or methods by which you can obtain the fixed overhead absorption rate per unit. I've told you that your fixed overhead absorption rate per unit is still the same as the standard rate per unit, and the one per hour is still the same as the standard rate per hour. So now that you have got your fixed overhead absorption rate per unit to be 3.5, how much will be your fixed overheads absorbed? You know, you want to compute your fixed overhead total variance or total fixed overhead variance. Total fixed overhead variance. I've told you earlier that it is the difference between the fixed overheads absorbed. Fixed overheads absorbed. I've told you that to calculate your fixed overhead absorbed, you multiply your overhead absorption rate per unit, which was arrived at to be $3.5, multiplied by the actual production, not the budgeted production. Back to the question where you have the actual information. The actual, you are given fixed production overhead. This is the actual fixed overhead. This is the actual units, actual production, 6,460. 6,460. That is the actual production. So we have 3.5 times 6,460, and that will give you, since it is per unit, so and multiply by the unit. So that will give us 3.5 times 6,460. Then we have 22,610. $22,610. That is the fixed overheads absorbed. Then minus the actual fixed overheads. Actual fixed overheads incurred. You go back to where you have actual result. The actual, we have actual fixed production overheads 24,000 200. The actual fixed production overheads is given to be $24,200. $24,200. When you subtract, then you have the difference minus 24,200. Then the difference is 1,590. $1,590. So that is the total fixed overheads variance. This is an under absorption because the one absorbed is less than the actual. I've told you that an under absorption is an adverse variance. So that means the total fixed overhead variance we have adverse of 1,590. That is total fixed overheads variance. 1,590 adverse. Yes, and I have told you earlier that the total fixed overheads variance, I've told you that it can be divided into two: the fixed overheads expenditure variance and the fixed overheads capacity variance. Now back to the requirement C. In the C, you are to compute the fixed overhead expenditure variance. Fixed overhead expenditure variance. I've told you that another word for fixed overhead expenditure variance is the fixed overheads budget variance. You either call it expenditure variance or you call it budget variance. That is requirement C. Fixed overheads expenditure variance. Fixed overhead expenditure variance. I've told you that it is the difference between the budgeted fixed overheads, and the actual fixed overheads incurred. Budgeted fixed overheads minus actual fixed overheads. The budgeted fixed overheads is given in the question. The budgeted fixed overheads, where you have the budget. The budget one, budget fixed production overhead, 22,960. Then how much is the actual fixed overheads? Fixed overheads, the actual fixed overheads, 24,200. The budget is 22,960, while the actual is 24,200. So what is the difference between the two? The budgeted fixed overhead is 22,960. 22,960 minus actual fixed overhead, and that is given to be 24,200. So now what is the difference between the budgeted fixed overheads and the actual fixed overheads? The difference between the budgeted fixed overheads, which is 22,960, and the actual fixed overhead, which is 24,200. Then we have the difference of 1,240. Therefore, fixed overheads expenditure variance, the difference is $1,240, and the actual fixed overhead exceed budget. So that's to show that it is an adverse variance. Adverse. That is all about the requirement C. Then the requirement D. Let's go back to the question. The requirement D. D, you are to compute the fixed overhead volume variance. I've told you earlier that the fixed overhead volume variance, I've told you that it can be obtained in two ways. Fixed overhead volume variance. Fixed overhead volume variance. I've told you that volume is referring to the output or production. That is why I said there are two outputs: the budgeted output budgeted production or budgeted output, budgeted production or budgeted output minus actual production or actual output multiplied by, I've told you that both budget production and actual production, I've told you that it is per unit. So that means you are going to use the standard rate per unit or fixed overhead absorption rate per unit. Let me put standard rate per unit, since both of these are in units. So standard rate per unit, I've told you that it's still the same as the fixed overhead absorption rate per unit. Now back to the question, what is your budgeted production? Our budgeted production budgeted production is 6,560, and actual production actual 6,460. Budget is 6,560, while actual is 6,460. Then multiply by the standard rate per unit, and our standard rate per unit have been calculated earlier. We got $3.5. The standard rate per unit is $3.5. This or this, which was obtained in two ways. So $3.5. Therefore, substituting into the formula, the budgeted production, our budgeted production is 6,560 minus actual production, which is 6,460, multiplied by the standard rate per unit, which is $3.5. So if you find the difference between, we have 6,560 minus 6,460, then difference of 100 times 3.5, and that is 350. Therefore, fixed overheads volume variance is $350. The budgeted production exceeds actual, so meaning that what was produced was lesser than planned. So that is to show that it is an adverse variance. Now I've told you that the total fixed overheads, when you sum up the total fixed overheads variance, I've divided this into two: the fixed overheads expenditure variance and the fixed overheads volume variance. Fixed overheads volume variance. Then for fixed overhead volume variance, we got 350 adverse, 350 adverse, 350 adverse. For fixed overhead expenditure variance, we got 1,240 adverse, 1,240 adverse. Adverse plus adverse, 1,240 plus 1,350, 1,240 plus 350, then you have 1,590. 1,590 adverse. Now, remember, if you check the total fixed overheads variance we've obtained the other time, our total fixed overheads variance, and we got 1,590 adverse, 1,590 adverse, which agrees with the result obtained here when we sum up the expenditure and volume. So it agrees with that. So that is the first method of calculating the volume variance. No, I've told you that your fixed overhead volume variance, I said it can be obtained in two ways. Here we compare the production output, the budgeted production with the actual. But another formula I gave you, I said the fixed overhead volume variance, method 2. I said the fixed overhead volume variance, fixed overhead volume variance. I said it is the difference between the budgeted hours, and the actual hours. And the standard hours. Budgeted hours and the standard hours multiplied by the standard rate per hour. Standard rate per hour. The budgeted hour was obtained by multiplying the standard hours. Budgeted hours was obtained by multiplying the standard hours by the budgeted output. Our budgeted hours is 13,120 hours. Budgeted hours 13,120 hours. 13,120 hours minus standard hours. Remember, to obtain our standard hours, I used to put standard hours. I've told you that anytime you want to calculate your standard hours, you have to press it by multiplying by the actual production. And the standard hours is given to be 2 hours. The standard hours is given to be 2 hours. If you check the question, you are given the standard time to produce each unit is 2 hours. Multiplied by the actual production. The actual production is 6,460. 6,460. So 6,460. 6,460. 2 times 6,460. That means the standard hours will be 12,960 hours. 12,960 hours. We said budgeted hours, which is 13,120, minus standard hours, and our standard hours is 12,960, multiplied by the standard rate per hour. The standard rate per hour was obtained from the requirement A. The standard rate per hour, so which is fixed overhead absorption rate, standard rate per hour, and we got fixed overhead absorption rate, which is 1.75 per labor hour, so it's $1.75. So the standard rate per hour is 1.75. So we have $1.75. That is the rate per hour. So if you have 13,120 minus 12,960, then the difference is 200. 200 times 1.75, then we have 350. We have 350 adverse. 350 adverse. So that is the fixed overhead volume variance. That is another way through which you may calculate, or in which you may calculate your fixed overhead volume variance. That is requirement D. Back to the requirement E. You are to compute the fixed overhead efficiency variance. Fixed overhead efficiency variance. I've told you that efficiency is always efficient. So that the formula for efficiency under labor, under variable overheads, and under fixed overheads are the same. The formula for calculating the efficiency under variable overheads, under labor, and under fixed overheads are the same. So, fixed overheads efficiency variance now. Fixed overheads efficiency variance. Fixed overheads efficiency variance. So that is requirement E. Fixed overheads efficiency variance. And I said this is standard hours, and your standard hours must be based on actual production minus actual hours multiplied by the standard rate. It will be standard rate per hour. Since this and this are hours, are in hours. Our standard hours based on actual production. The standard hours is 2 and the actual production is 6,460. 6,460 and we got 12,960. 12,960 hours earlier. So these have been calculated earlier. Our standard hours is 12,960 minus actual hours. What is the actual labor hour? Actual labor hours. We have labor hours 12,600. 12,600. So minus 12,600 multiplied by the standard rate per hour, which we've calculated that to be 1.75. So 12,960 minus 12,600. Then we have 360. 360 times 1.75. Then we have 630. Therefore, fixed overhead efficiency variance is $630. And $630 less hour were used, so labor is more efficient, so that is favorable. 630 favorable. The requirement F, and you are to compute the fixed overhead capacity variance. Fixed overhead capacity variance. Fixed overhead capacity variance. Fixed overhead capacity variance. I've told you earlier that this is the difference between the actual hours and the budgeted hours. Budgeted hours multiplied by the standard rate per hour. Actual hours minus budgeted hours multiplied by the standard rate per hour. The actual hours remain 12,600 hours. The actual hours remain 12,600. That is our actual hours. It still remains 12,600. 12,600 minus the budgeted hours. The budgeted hours, I think we have calculated that earlier. Or if that have not been calculated, we have budgeted hours. Budgeted hours, and say this is standard hours, which is 2 hours, multiplied by the budgeted production. The budgeted production is 6,560. When you multiply that, then you have the budgeted hour. 2 times 6,560, then we have 13,120 hours. That is our budgeted hours. So budgeted hours 13,120 multiplied by the standard rate per hour, and the standard rate per hour is 1.75. 1.75. So 12,600 minus 13,120 times 1.75. Then you have 910. Therefore, fixed overhead capacity variance is 910 adverse. Therefore, fixed overhead capacity variance is 910 adverse. It is adverse. This is your actual capacity. It's less than the budgeted capacity. So you budget for 13,120 and you actually have capacity for 12,600. That is to show that it is an adverse variance. 910 adverse. That is fixed overheads capacity variance. If you sum up the fixed overhead capacity variance and the fixed overheads efficiency variance, it will give us the fixed overheads volume variance. The sum of the fixed overhead capacity variance, your fixed overheads volume variance. Fixed overheads volume variance. I said this will be divided into two: the capacity and the efficiency. And efficiency. Fixed overhead capacity variance. We got 910 adverse. Fixed overhead capacity variance 910 adverse. So this one is 910 $910 adverse. Fixed overheads efficiency variance. Fixed overheads efficiency variance. We got 630 favorable. 630 favorable. Favorable is positive, while adverse is negative. So minus 910 plus 630. Then you have 2 fixed overheads $280. So let me check my solution because it is supposed to agree with that. So our fixed overhead capacity actual hour is 12,600 and the budgeted hours is 12,960. Sorry, budgeted hour. Let me calculate that. 6,560 times 2, we have 13,120. So if you have 12,600 minus that 520 times 1.75, it's 910 adverse. So that is correct. 910 adverse. Why efficiency variance? The standard hours. Let me recheck the fixed overhead efficiency variance. Fixed overhead efficiency variance. Standard hours based on actual production. Standard hours is 2 hours. Actual production is 6,460. 6,460 times 2. Then we have 12,920. Sorry, this is 12,920. That is where the mistake lies. Not 12,960. So this is 920. So 12,920 minus 12,600. Then we have 320. 320 times 1.75 times 1.75. Then we have 560. This is 560. 560 favorable. That is fixed overhead efficiency variance. So that is where there was mistake. 560 favorable. That is fixed overhead efficiency variance. So 910 adverse minus 560 favorable. Then you'll be left with 350 adverse. 350 adverse. That is fixed overhead volume variance. 350 adverse. So if you check our workings, where we calculated our fixed overhead volume variance, we got 350 adverse. Fixed overhead volume variance 350 adverse, which is in agreement with the result obtained. That is all about fixed overhead variances. Please, if you have not subscribed in the past, and if you are just coming across my channel, please don't forget to click on the red subscribe button so that you'll be receiving notification message each time I drop a new video. Thanks.